On the previous video, we touched upon this briefly, the idea of adding transits to dashas. Now, the idea of the transit, there's a few things we have to consider. First of all, number one, the transit activates the dasha. What does that mean? Let's say a person has Jupiter dasha running, and let's say Jupiter is in the 9th house, and Jupiter rules the 9th house. So what that tells us is that there is an agenda for committed relationship and marriage to develop. Now, since Jupiter is in its own home in the 9th house, that's a good agenda, which means that the whole Jupiter dasha will be geared towards or around the indications of Jupiter in its own home in the 9th house. Again, finding one's dharma, following our culture, relationships with gurus, religious aspects coming out, committed relationships, marriages, all these sorts of things are related to Jupiter in that particular position. And it's also a position that speaks to education. So a person might be involved in increasing their education or working in an educational field. Again, because this is the flavor of the dasha of Jupiter in the 9th, owning the 9th in its own home. Now, when are there going to be particular and specific situations arising? It will be when planets transit areas of the chart which are conducive to supporting that particular agenda of the dasha. Now let's pretend that we have Jupiter transiting through that 9th house, or aspecting that 9th house, at the same time the person's in the dasha of the 9th house. Well, that's going to bring in more potential, more energy for an event to occur. We can even use, for example, using Jupiter in relationships, in a woman's chart, if Jupiter is transiting the ascendant, well, then what that tells us is that when Jupiter hits the first bhava cusp, or a sensitive point within the ascendant, and they're in that Jupiter dasha, well, that's when a potential mate or marriage will occur or come into their life, or a marriage partner will come into their life, because the trigger transit is occurring. Now, let's pretend it's more of a negative situation. Let's pretend that within a person's chart we now have Saturn and Mars in a bad Lajatati Avashta in the 9th house. And let's say that Saturn is severely starving Mars. And so if this is happening in the 9th house, well, we know that there's going to be some frustration, some obstacles, some delays, some aggression, because this is what happens when Mars and Saturn get together in regards to relationships. All right, so that's the dasha. The dasha, say Saturn or Mars, or a Saturn-Mars dasha, and these two planets are in the 9th house. So that's going to bring us where a person's starting to get tired of their committed relationship or have more frustration around it. Now, they might make a decision then and there to quit the relationship, but now let's say that Saturn is transiting through a person's 7th house, or Mars is transiting through a person's 1st house. Well, Mars transiting through a person's 1st house is going to make the person more aggressive, which means that they're going to respond more to the aggressive aspect of that dasha. Saturn or Ketu, let's say, going through the 7th house, while they're in a Saturn-Mars dasha for the 9th house, well, then that's going to make them more frustrated with their spouse, because that's what Ketu does. And Ketu is a reorganizing energy, which shows that it could give them the reason to want to reorganize their relationships or get distance or get a break from their mate. So what we see, we have to understand what's going on in a particular house, a particular dasha. And then, once we know that, it's a very distinct possibility that if we get enough of those dashas lining up down to the 5th level, that we'll experience something just by the dasha. But more than likely, there does require a trigger transit, some kind of planetary movement to aspect or conjunct or impact a sensitive part of the person's chart related to the situation to make the thing occur. Same thing with accidents. You can have a person in a 6th house dasha. Let's say, what would be a good example of 6th house dasha? Let's say we have a difficult Jupiter in the 6th house. Let's say a debilitated Jupiter in the 6th house. Well, that can show issues with the liver, issues with the brain, issues with blood sugar, just as an example. And if we have a negative transit going through that 6th house, or if we have Jupiter in a bad situation by transit, well, then that can bring up issues which will contribute to liver problems. It'll bring up issues that will contribute to diseases with the brain. But there has to be that combination of the transit along with the Dasha. And then, as I mentioned in the previous video, we also have to line this up with the particular Varga. So it may be that, going to our previous example, that someone has Saturn and Mars in bad situations, bad Logitati Avashtas, within the 9th divisional, within the 9th house. Okay, so that means that their path, the Rashi, the birth chart represents our path, is speaking to a rough period within the marriage. But let's say now we look at the Navamsha, the D9, and we see that the planets that are activated by Dasha are in good dignity, or they're in good houses. Well, what that can show is the path itself can be hard, but the person will manage. They'll be able to get through it, come out the other end, because that key Varga for the 9th house has strong placements with the 2 planets that we're talking about, Saturn and Mars. If it's Saturn, and it's in good dignity, good situation, maybe in a good dignity, or a good dignity plus a good house placement, well then what Saturn does in the Navamsha is it allows a person to endure the difficulties, to feel that even though they have these difficulties, that they're able to make it through. They're not bothered by the little troublesome things. They see the point in enduring and moving forward. If it's Mars, and Mars is in good dignity and in a good house, trine or angle, then Mars represents our rationality, our rational mind. Are we able to do what it takes to be successful, to move through the obstacles and the difficulties? Can we think it through and make sense of it? Can we be reasonable about it? And if it's the case in their Navamsha, then even if we have those difficulties in the birth chart, more than likely they'll still be able to make it through. So remember, the birth chart represents the path. What are the things you're going to experience? The Varga itself shows how you deal with those particular things. Same thing can happen with 2nd house or 11th house issues. In the birth chart, if there's some difficult dashas running in that way, the person might experience difficulties with their finances. But if we look at the Hora, and if we look at the Chaturtamsha, the 4th divisional chart, we see that those planets are actually solid in there. Then the path shows that maybe their transmission goes out. Now they have to spend $2,000 to get a new transmission for their car. But the Vargas that deal with finances are good, which shows that they have the capacity to deal with it. Now, if both the birth chart and the particular Varga are bad, well, then that's where you really start to get some serious issues coming into play, where the trouble arises and you can't deal with it. So always have to remember that. There are these different layers and levels we have to consider. And we also have to consider the transits. The transits will help us zero in and figure out when exactly is something going to happen. If you start using the transits with the dashas, number one, you'll see how complicated and vast prediction actually is, as long as you're not using psychic intuition or something of that nature, which a lot of astrologers do have. And number two, you also see that there is a logic behind how the world works, which is really fascinating. And that you have to have multiple things coming together at once before you get a specific experience expressing. So there can be potentials, but those potentials only happen when everything lines up together. Just like, if you have someone who has addictive tendencies, if they never get around substances that are problematic for them, well, they have the tendency, but it never gets activated. If you have someone who has very good talents and skills to be maybe a successful writer or a business person, but they never have the motivation to go out and put themselves in situations where that can occur, doesn't matter. It's not going to happen. So you have to have the confluence of multiple things coming together. And this is how we start to look at the dashas. This is how we start to look at the transits, just to see what's what and when is something going to occur? When is it most likely going to occur? And keeping in mind the idea of free will, if you're in a dasha for something good and the transit's not there, you can still use your willpower to try. And that's the thing that a lot of people get tripped up on astrologically, is they don't try because they just want to know, when is it just going to work out. And I had one of my previous students, who I refer clients to, worked with someone, and I was very happy to hear the sort of feedback that I got. But the person was wanting, finances and money and these sorts of things. And the student said, "Well, you'll get it as soon as you'll get money once you start working hard for it." And that right there cuts out that whole need that someone has, that it's just going to work out astrologically because of a transit. So if you're in a particular situation, particular dasha where there's a possibility, you can use your willpower, you can use prayer, you can use your conscious intention to maybe invoke or empower that aspect of consciousness that the planet represents within you, so you don't have to wait for the transit. It's not easy to do. It's much easier if you have regular meditation practice and you have this sense of connection to everything and don't feel like you're just a limited individual, sort of alien in this world. It works much easier that way, which is again why I really propose that you take up a regular meditation practice and try to connect with these aspects of your consciousness that the planets represent. But it's possible, and that's why we have remedial measures. That's why we have upayas for this purpose. So consider all this. Start looking at charts. Start looking at specific events in people's lives. Get some biographies and get the charts of the person that you have the biography for. And just start taking notes of, when does this transit occur? When does this dasha occur? How does it line up? It's really a fascinating topic. So anyway, it's a pleasure to talk to you again, and be in touch soon.